Before we move forward, please like, share, and subscribe Strategic Vanguard and be up to date with the latest news and happenings from the world of defense, strategic, and international affairs. Tune into our video channels in YouTube and Rumble. And if you want to hear the audio version, tune into our Strategic Vanguard channels in Spotify and Amazon Music.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and give you the clearest insights. Today, we're tackling something huge, a topic that's still making waves globally in markets and politics. Let's start with a quote, actually. It really sets the scene. In the 21st century, wars will not just be fought with tanks and missiles, but with tariffs and trade barriers. End quote. Does that ring true for you? Because it feels incredibly spot on as we, unpack former President Trump's big tariff moves, especially those hitting steel, aluminum, and, a lot of Chinese goods. And these weren't just small tweaks, right? Trump's actions really kicked off what a lot of people called a new kind of battle. It was a battle that seriously reshaped global supply chains, strained relationships with allies, and really ramped up the whole U.S.-China rivalry. You probably remember President Trump tweeting trade wars are good and easy to win, but looking back, did it actually play out that way? So our mission today is to figure out why these tariffs happened, look at the immediate impacts, some expected, some not so much, and trace those shockwaves around the world. Think of this deep dive as your shortcut. You get the essential understanding of this key moment in global economics and geopolitics without getting buried in complexity.
Yeah, and that's a really important frame because while we're mostly focusing on the economics and the geopolitics today, it's worth mentioning right at the start, there's this fascinating legal angle too. There's actually been a recent federal appeals court ruling on whether these tariffs were even constitutional. It's a real twist. We'll circle back to that at the end, kind of as food for thought. But yeah, setting the stage, Trump's moves absolutely pushed the U.S.-China relationship from rivalry into, something like a full-scale confrontation, much bigger than just a standard trade spat.
Okay, so let's unpack the beginning. To really get why Trump went down this road, we need to look at America's history with tariffs. It's always been a bit complicated, hasn't it? You've got history like the Smoot-Hawley tariff back in 1930. A lot of historians say that just made the Great Depression worse, kicked off a global trade war. But then, after World War II, the U.S. completely shifted gears, became the big champion of free trade, setting up things like GATT, which later became the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Open markets became the goal, right? But even while that was the official policy, that sort of free trade era, there was always this other current, this dissent bubbling up. Especially in places like the industrial heartlands, people felt globalization was hollowing out American manufacturing, and they pointed fingers at cheap imports, particularly from China, after trying to join the WTO in 2001, blaming those imports for factory closures, job losses, hitting regions like the Rust Belt hard. And Donald Trump, he tapped right into that anger with his whole America First thing. He argued past leaders basically sold out American workers, and that China was cheating, stealing tech, manipulating currency, that kind of thing. He promised something totally different.
And it's really striking how fast those promises turn into action, especially in 2018. We saw a few key moves. First, you had the Section 232 tariffs. These used an old law from 62, I think, letting the president slap tariffs on imports if they're a national security threat. So Trump used that, put 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum imports. The argument was, the U.S. needs its own supply for defense, can't rely on potential rivals. Then came Section 301 tariffs, and this was the big one. Section 301 is a part of the Trade Act of 1974, a tool to fight unfair foreign trade practices. The U.S. accused China of all sorts of things, stealing intellectual property, forcing companies to hand over technology, unfair subsidies. And that led to tariffs on $370 billion worth of Chinese goods, covered almost everything, electronics, clothes, you name it. Oh, and there were also threats of auto tariffs, mainly aimed at Europe and Japan. Those were mostly used as leverage in negotiations, though, not fully put in place. Now, other presidents, sure, even Reagan, they used tariffs sometimes selectively. But what made Trump different was the sheer scale and his whole philosophy behind it. He really saw trade as a zero-sum battlefield. If someone wins, someone else has to lose. Not a cooperative thing. That thinking, that scale, that was basically the birth of the modern U.S. trade war.
Okay, so we've got the why. Now, the million-dollar question, maybe what you're thinking. These tariffs were sold as a way to protect American workers, American industries. Did they actually do that? Let's start with steel. What happened to American steelmakers right away?
Well, domestically, it was pretty nuanced, a mixed bag, really, for American steel companies. Yeah, there was a short-term boost. Prices went up, profits looked better. That definitely helped the political message. But, and this is a big but, industries that use steel paid the price. Think construction, cars, machinery makers, their costs shot up. There were economic estimates floating around back then suggesting that for every job supposedly saved in steel, you actually lost several jobs in industries that buy steel because of those higher costs. And maybe the group hit hardest inside the U.S. American farmers. China hit back hard, right? With tariffs targeting U.S. soybeans, pork, other farm goods, that caused massive losses in the Midwest.
Right, you can just picture it. A farmer relying on China exports suddenly facing huge tariffs. Devastating.
Absolutely. It got so bad, the government had to step in with multi-billion-dollar farm bailouts just to try and soften the blow. And then there's us, the consumers. Tariffs, fundamentally, they're just a tax on imports. And that tax, it mostly got passed on to consumers. Studies showed folks paid more for washing machines, electronics, all sorts of things. It's also important to remember, inflationary pressure started building well before the whole COVID supply chain mess hit later on. These tariffs played a part early on.
That is a complex picture. Gains for steel, but losses downstream. Farmers hit hard, consumers paying more. So with all those trade-offs, did the administration or supporters kind of acknowledge this mixed bag publicly, or was that job-saved narrative just too strong politically?
That's a good point. Politically, the focus stayed very much on the protection angle. It was a powerful message. But the economic studies, especially by 2019, were showing a different story. They suggested tariffs had actually reduced U.S. GDP slightly. And crucially, they hadn't sparked some big manufacturing revival across the board. So basically, the economic payoff looked questionable. What you see is this disconnect. The political goal was clear: protect workers, but the economic reality was often this internal reshuffling. Gains in one area often meant pain in another, making the overall net benefit for the U.S. economy pretty debatable.
Yeah, what really jumps out is how everything's connected. Tariffs aren't imposed in isolation. Trump's moves didn't just cause ripples. You said it unleashed a storm globally.
Correct.
Okay, let's widen the lens. China was the main target. What exactly did Beijing do?
China's reaction was fast, it was smart, and it had multiple layers. Directly, yeah, they slapped their own tariffs on U.S. goods. And they were careful about it, especially targeting politically sensitive sectors like agriculture. There was no accident. It was designed to put pressure on Trump in the Midwest, right in his electoral base, hit voters where it hurt. But China was also playing a longer game. It wasn't just about tariff for tariff. They really doubled down on domestic industrial policies. Think Made in China 2025. That's their big plan to become a leader in high tech. They pushed harder to become self-reliant in semiconductors, aviation, advanced manufacturing. So in a way, maybe unexpectedly, Trump's tariffs actually strengthened China's resolve to decouple from relying too much on U.S. tech and supply chains. And here's the kicker. Even U.S. allies weren't safe, not spared, as you said. Canada, Mexico, the European Union all got hit with those steel and aluminum tariffs. These are major partners. That caused, understandably, deep frustration. Canada put on its own retaliatory tariffs. The EU took the U.S. to the WTO. Even India got drawn in. It lost its special trade status under something called GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, that let developing countries export some stuff duty-free to the U.S. So India lost that benefit and then imposed its own tariffs on American things like almonds and apples. This whole episode also put a big question mark over the World Trade Organization. Was it still relevant? Trump's actions raised questions about the WTO's relevance because the U.S. was sort of bypassing the usual process. Lots of countries challenged the U.S. measures there. Trump himself wasn't shy about criticizing the WTO, calling it ineffective, even threatening to pull the U.S. out completely. That definitely weakened the multilateral trade system, made it seem less reliable, and maybe one of the biggest impacts globally. Supply chains started shifting. Companies began seriously looking at China plus one strategies, meaning, okay, keep some production in China, but add another location, Vietnam, Mexico, India maybe, to spread the risk. That whole reshaping process, it continues today. It's a lasting legacy. So yeah, Trump's tariffs didn't just poke China, they shook up the whole global economic setup.
Okay, fascinating stuff on the global front. Now, let's shift gears slightly. Let's step back from just the dollars and cents for a second and look at the larger strategic picture. Because this trade war, it clearly wasn't just about steel prices or soybean exports, right? It felt very much like a front in the larger U.S.-China rivalry. How did each country sort of view this strategically? What were their goals on that bigger chessboard?
Right. Strategically, the interpretations were quite different. For the U.S. side, you could see the tariffs as a tool to try and contain China's rise, to punish what they saw as unfair trade practices, yes, but also to signal, hey, the era of just engaging with China hoping it liberalizes, that's over. China, meanwhile, framed it very differently. They presented it as a test of resilience. They portrayed themselves almost as the victim of American bullying. That played well domestically, rallied nationalism, and interestingly, they tried to position themselves internationally as a defender of globalization against American protectionism. Now, did the U.S. achieve its strategic goals? Again, it's mixed. Sure, the tariffs hurt China in the short term. Exports definitely took a hit. Economic growth slowed a bit. But as we talked about, China adapted. They worked on boosting their own domestic market, found other trading partners, and really strengthened ties elsewhere, especially in Asia and Europe, partly through things like RCEP, that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a huge Asian trade deal that notably doesn't include the U.S.
And what about other players caught in the middle, like India?
Yeah, India's situation really highlights the complexity. It was a delicate position. On one hand, the U.S.-China tension created openings for India, maybe attract investment leaving China, boost exports. But as we noted, India also faced U.S. tariffs itself and pressure from the U.S. to sort of pick a side. It was a classic example of India trying to maintain its strategic autonomy, navigating between these big powers. But maybe the biggest strategic fallout, the one with the longest shadow, was the erosion of multilateralism. It forces you, the listener, to ask, if the U.S., traditionally the anchor of the system, can just cite national security and bypass the WTO rules, then what stopped other countries from doing the same? And you did see a shift. The world seemed to move more towards a fragmented system, regional trade blocs, bilateral deals, instead of relying on that global WTO framework. So, yeah, these tariffs weren't just an economic blip. They were truly a strategic turning point. Changed the game.
Okay, wow. So let's quickly pull the threads together for you. What we've seen is that Trump's tariffs really did reshape the global economy. They had these really mixed results back home in the U.S. They definitely sped up the confrontation with China, and they weakened those global trade institutions like the WTO. But now, here's where the story takes maybe its most interesting twist. We get into this fascinating legal question. Trump used existing laws, citing things like national security, which gave the White House a lot of power. But wait a minute, the Constitution says trade policy is primarily supposed to be Congress's job, right? That creates a real tension there.
Exactly. That fundamental tension, executive power versus congressional authority in trade, set the stage for legal challenges. And this is the really dramatic part we hinted at earlier. A federal appeals court recently weighed in, and they actually struck down Trump's tariffs, finding them illegal and against constitutional provisions.
Whoa, okay, so what was their reasoning? What kind of big questions did that ruling raise?
Well, it went right to the heart of some fundamental issues. Like, can a president just use national security as a kind of blank check for huge economic actions like tariffs? Did Trump have actually overstepped the separation of powers that's built into the U.S. system? And maybe most importantly, for the future, what are the limits? How much leeway should presidents have in trade policy, and when should the courts step in? So for you, the listener, here's something really provocative to chew on as we wrap up. Trade wars, yeah, they may start at customs posts with taxes on goods, but they may ultimately be decided by judges interpreting the Constitution. Think about that. These huge economic shifts, these geopolitical power plays, they can end up boiling down to fundamental questions about law, about power, and about the balance between the different branches of government itself. A real constitutional dimension to it all.